She'd spent 22 years believing she was finally home, never knowing the people who called her daughter were already planning to throw her away. That single moment, when the lawyer's voice cut through the silence of the Preston family estate, changed everything Evelyn thought she knew about love, family, and where she belonged in this world. You know how they say blood is thicker than water? Well, she learned that greed is thicker than both. Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well wherever you're watching this from. Whether you're at home, at work, or just trying to get through another day, I want you to know this story is going to stay with you. It's about justice, karma, and how sometimes the universe has a way of making things right when you least expect it. How's the weather treating you today? I hope it's better than the storm Evelyn was about to walk into. Her name is Evelyn Carter, though for most of her life people called her Evelyn Preston. This is the story of how she went from being a discarded orphan to the rightful owner of a multi-million-dollar empire, and how one tiny key hidden in a Bible completely destroyed the family that tried to destroy her. The moment she walked back into that mansion and placed her mother's Bible on their marble table while they watched from the street, knowing she now owned everything they thought was theirs forever, that moment made every single day of her pain worth it. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand just how naive Evelyn was about the people she trusted with her whole heart. She was 8 years old when they found her sleeping on the steps of St. Mary's orphanage. Starved, shaking, clutching a teddy bear that was falling apart at the seams, whispering the name of a mother she could barely remember. The social workers said she'd been living on the streets for weeks, maybe months. Her birth mother had overdosed, her father was nowhere to be found, and she had no other family willing to take her in. For 3 years, Evelyn lived at St. Mary's. 3 years of sharing rooms with 6 other kids, wearing donated clothes that never quite fit, and watching families come through looking for children to love. But families like the ones who visited St. Mary's, they wanted babies. They wanted kids who looked like them. They wanted children who came without histories, without trauma, without the kind of damage that sleeping on church steps leaves behind. Then, when she was 11, everything changed. Richard and Margaret Preston walked through those doors like they owned the world, and honestly, they pretty much did. Richard Preston was one of the wealthiest real estate developers in the state. Preston Estates had properties from the mountains to the coast, shopping centers, luxury developments, commercial buildings worth millions. Margaret was this elegant woman who spoke softly but commanded attention everywhere she went. They said they wanted to give a child opportunities. They said they believed in charity. They said they wanted to expand their family. Evelyn believed every word. When they chose her, she thought she was the luckiest kid in the world. Here were these successful, beautiful people who wanted to take her home, give her their name, send her to private schools, and make her part of their family. She was so grateful she cried for hours the first night in their house. Looking back now, she should have noticed the signs. She should have paid attention to how Richard's biological children, David and Caroline, looked at her like she was some kind of charity case they had to tolerate. She should have wondered why she got the smallest bedroom, why her Christmas presents were always practical while theirs were extravagant, why she was introduced as their adopted daughter instead of just their daughter. But she was 11, and she was desperate to belong somewhere. So Evelyn convinced herself that any family was better than no family. She told herself she was being dramatic when she felt left out. She made excuses for why she always felt like a guest in their house instead of a daughter in her home. Margaret was different, though. She seemed to genuinely care about Evelyn. She helped her with homework, taught her how to braid her hair, read her stories before bed, even when she got too old for bedtime stories. When Evelyn struggled in school because of everything she'd missed living on the streets, Margaret hired tutors. When kids at her new private school made comments about her background, Margaret showed up to talk to the principal. Richard tolerated her. David and Caroline resented her. But Margaret, she acted like she actually loved Evelyn. So she worked harder than any kid should have to work to prove she deserved their kindness. Evelyn got straight A's. She never caused trouble. She helped with chores without being asked. She pretended not to notice when family photos were taken without her or when family vacations were planned for times when she'd be at summer camp. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. And let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family, because what happened next is going to show you that sometimes the people who make you feel smallest are actually the ones who need you most. Because here's what Evelyn didn't know at 11, or 15, or even 25. Margaret Preston was quietly building something in secret. Something that would change everything. But first, Evelyn had to survive 22 years of believing she was lucky to be tolerated, grateful for scraps of affection, and convinced that she owed the Preston family her entire life for their charity. She had no idea that the betrayal charity was about to go in the complete opposite direction. The years that followed turned Evelyn into exactly what the Preston family claimed they wanted, a success story they could point to at dinner parties. She excelled at everything she touched, but what they didn't realize was that her drive came from a deep fear that if she wasn't perfect, they might decide she wasn't worth keeping. By the time she was 16, Evelyn was valedictorian of her private school, captain of the debate team, and had already been accepted to 3 Ivy League universities with full scholarships. Richard would brag about her achievements to his business partners, always making sure to mention how they'd rescued her from the orphanage. Margaret would beam with pride, but there was something different in her eyes when she looked at Evelyn. Something that felt more genuine than the performative pride Richard displayed. The first crack in Evelyn's faith in the family came during her senior year of high school. She'd been accepted to Harvard Law with a full scholarship, but David, who was 2 years older, had just been rejected from the same program despite Richard's connections and a hefty donation to the university. Evelyn found David and Caroline in the kitchen one evening, their voices hushed but angry. "It's not fair," Caroline was saying. "She gets everything handed to her because she's the charity case. Colleges love that sob story." "Dad spent $50,000 trying to get me into Harvard," David replied bitterly. "But they'd rather take the little orphan girl who makes them look good." Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway, her acceptance letter still in her hand. She'd been so excited to share the news with them. "She doesn't even belong here," Caroline continued. "She's not really our sister. I don't know why Mom treats her like she is." That night, Evelyn lay in bed wondering if they were right. Had she gotten into Harvard because of her story rather than her grades? Was she really just a charity case the family kept around to feel good about themselves? When she tried to talk to Margaret about what she'd overheard, Margaret pulled her into her arms and held her tight. "Evelyn, honey, you earned every single thing you've achieved. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. You're brilliant and you're kind, and you work harder than anyone I know." Margaret paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Some people in this family might not see her worth, but I do. I've always seen it." Those words meant everything to Evelyn. They were what carried her through 4 years at Harvard, through law school, through passing the bar exam with flying colors. Every time doubt crept in, every time she felt like an outsider, she remembered Margaret saying she saw her worth. After law school, Evelyn joined a prestigious firm in the city, specializing in estate law. She was making 6 figures by age 25, had her own apartment, and was finally starting to feel like she'd proven herself worthy of the Preston name. She sent money home to help with household expenses, bought thoughtful gifts for everyone's birthdays, and called Margaret every Sunday. But success didn't change how the rest of the family treated her. If anything, it seemed to make David and Caroline more resentful. Richard was polite but distant, acknowledging her achievements only when it benefited him socially. At family gatherings, Evelyn still felt like she was performing, still felt like she had to justify her place at the table. The only person who made her feel truly welcome was Margaret. As Margaret aged, their relationship deepened. Margaret would call Evelyn just to chat, asking about her cases, her dating life, her dreams for the future. She remembered every detail Evelyn shared and followed up with thoughtful questions. When Evelyn went through a difficult breakup, Margaret drove 3 hours to the city just to take her to lunch and let her cry. "You know," Margaret said during one of those visits, "I need to show you something important when you come home next. Something I've been working on." "What is it?" Evelyn asked. Margaret smiled mysteriously. "Just some paperwork I need help with. You're the lawyer in the family now." But before that visit could happen, Margaret's health took a sudden turn. At 73, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months, maybe less. Evelyn immediately took a leave of absence from her job and moved back to the Preston house to care for Margaret. For 6 months, she was there every day. She cooked Margaret's favorite foods, read to her from the Bible, organized her medications, and drove her to every doctor's appointment. She held Margaret's hand through the pain, helped her shower when she became too weak to do it alone, and slept on a cot in Margaret's room so she wouldn't be scared during the night. David visited twice. Caroline came by maybe once a week, but only for 20 minutes at a time, always complaining that the house smelled like medicine. Richard hired nurses during the day, but spent most of his time at the office, claiming he needed to keep the business running. "They're preparing," Margaret whispered to Evelyn one evening, her voice weak, but her eyes still sharp. "They think I don't know, but I hear them. They're already dividing up what they think is theirs." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "Richard's been meeting with lawyers. David and Caroline have been asking about specific properties, specific accounts. They think because I'm dying, I'm not paying attention anymore." Margaret squeezed Evelyn's hand. "But I see everything, honey. I always have." "Mom, you're going to get better," Evelyn said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Margaret smiled sadly. "Evelyn, I need you to know something. No matter what happens after I'm gone, no matter what anyone tells you, remember that you are my daughter. Not adopted, not charity. My daughter. And daughters take care of each other." Those were some of the last coherent words Margaret spoke. She passed away 3 days later, with Evelyn holding her hand and reading psalms aloud. The funeral was a spectacle. Richard spared no expense, filling the church with white lilies and hiring a string quartet. People came from all over the state to pay their respects to the Preston family. But Evelyn noticed how everyone offered condolences to Richard, David, and Caroline first. She was always an afterthought, always an Evelyn, of course. After the service, as people gathered at the Preston house for the reception, Evelyn overheard a conversation that stopped her heart. Richard was in his study with his lawyer, a thin man named Hendricks who'd been handling Preston family affairs for decades. "The will reading is scheduled for tomorrow," Hendricks was saying. "Everything is exactly as you requested." "Good," Richard replied. "Margaret got sentimental in her final years, but I made sure things are handled properly. Blood is blood, after all." "What about the girl?" Hendricks asked. "What about her?" "She's not family. She's had 22 years of generosity from us. That's more than most orphans get." Evelyn felt the world tilt. Margaret had always promised her the small pearl necklace that had belonged to Margaret's mother. She'd promised that Evelyn would always have a home with them. She'd promised that being adopted didn't make her less of a daughter. But listening to Richard talk, Evelyn realized that Margaret's promises might not have meant anything to the rest of the family. The next morning, she sat in the lawyer's office surrounded by people she'd called family for 22 years, her heart hammering with a terrible certainty that everything was about to change. And when Hendricks opened that will and began reading, Evelyn learned exactly how much her 22 years of love, loyalty, and sacrifice were worth to the Preston family. Absolutely nothing. The will reading took place in Hendricks' office on a gray Tuesday morning that would forever divide Evelyn's life into before and after. She sat in a leather chair that felt too big for her, surrounded by the Preston family in a semicircle that somehow excluded her even though she was physically present. Richard sat directly across from Hendricks' desk, his posture confident and relaxed. David lounged in his chair like he was waiting for Christmas morning. Caroline kept checking her phone, occasionally smiling at something on the screen. They all acted like this was a formality, like they already knew exactly what they were about to hear. Evelyn was the only one who looked nervous. Hendricks cleared his throat and began reading in that monotone voice lawyers perfect after decades of delivering life-changing news like its weather reports. I, Margaret Louise Preston, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The preliminary language felt endless. Evelyn's palms were sweating, and she kept thinking about Margaret's promises. The pearl necklace. The assurance that she'd always have a home. The way Margaret had held her hand and called her daughter. To my husband, Richard Preston, I leave the family home and all furnishings therein, along with controlling interest in Preston Estates. Richard nodded approvingly. This was expected. To my son, David Preston, I leave the portfolio of commercial properties in the downtown district, valued at approximately $4.2 million. David actually pumped his fist. Caroline elbowed him, but she was grinning too. To my daughter, Caroline Preston, I leave the residential development properties and the vacation home in Aspen, valued at approximately $3.8 million. Caroline squealed softly and grabbed David's arm. They were both trying to contain their excitement, but Evelyn could see them practically vibrating with glee. Hendricks continued reading through smaller bequests. Margaret's sister got some jewelry. Her longtime housekeeper got a year's salary. The church got a donation. Evelyn kept waiting for her name. She kept waiting for Hendricks to say, to my adopted daughter Evelyn, or even just to Evelyn Preston. She kept waiting for the pearl necklace to be mentioned, or Margaret's Bible, or something, anything that would prove Margaret hadn't forgotten about her. But as Hendricks neared the end of the document, Evelyn's name hadn't been mentioned once. And finally, Hendricks said, I leave my collection of first edition books to the local library to be displayed in a memorial reading room. That was it. Hendricks set the papers down and looked around the room. Are there any questions about the estate distribution? Evelyn's mouth was dry. She felt like she was drowning in plain sight. Excuse me, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Is that everything? The whole will? Hendricks looked confused. Yes, that's the complete document. Why do you ask? I just thought. Evelyn looked around the room at faces that had suddenly turned cold. Mom always said, Margaret always said I'd get her mother's pearl necklace. And she promised me I'd always have a home here. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face had transformed completely. Gone was any pretense of the grieving widower. In its place was something calculating and cruel. Evelyn, he said slowly, I think there's been some confusion. You're not mentioned in the will because you're not legally entitled to anything. Margaret may have made some sentimental promises, but legally speaking, you have no claim to this family's assets. But I'm her daughter, Evelyn said, hating how small her voice sounded. No, Richard said firmly. You're someone we took in out of charity. There's a difference. David was nodding along. Dad's right. We've been really generous to you over the years. College, law school, letting you live here all those months while Mom was sick. But that doesn't make you entitled to our inheritance. Caroline spoke up for the first time. Besides, it's not like you need the money. You have that fancy lawyer job in the city. Evelyn felt like she'd been slapped. I took leave from that job to take care of Mom. I've been here for 6 months with no income because I wanted to be with her. And that was your choice, Richard said. A choice you made as a grateful adopted child, not as an heir. Hendricks was clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Perhaps this family discussion should continue at home, he suggested. But Richard wasn't done. Actually, Hendricks, since we're all here, I think it's important to clarify Evelyn's situation. She's been living in our house for 6 months, but now that Margaret is gone and the estate is settled, I think it's time for her to make other arrangements. The words hit Evelyn like physical blows. Other arrangements? You're a grown woman with a career, Richard said. It's time for you to establish your own life, separate from this family. Evelyn looked around the room desperately. David was studying his fingernails. Caroline was back to checking her phone. Hendricks was shuffling papers like he wanted to disappear. You're kicking me out, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. We're encouraging your independence, Richard corrected. I think a week should be sufficient time for you to pack your belongings and find appropriate housing. Evelyn stood up on shaking legs. The room felt like it was spinning. 22 years of believing she belonged somewhere, 22 years of trying to earn love that was apparently never real, 22 years of calling these people family. Margaret loved me, she said, and she hated that her voice broke on the words. Margaret felt sorry for you, Richard replied. There's a difference between pity and love, though I suppose someone in your position might confuse the two. That night, Evelyn sat in Margaret's room, which apparently was no longer Margaret's room but Richard's room, or David's room, or whoever's room Richard decided it should be. She was supposed to be packing, but instead she was holding Margaret's Bible and crying. She'd found the Bible on Margaret's nightstand, and somehow it had ended up in the bag of personal items Richard had grudgingly allowed her to take. Margaret had read from this Bible every night, and it felt like the only connection Evelyn had left to the woman who had been the only real mother she'd ever known. As she flipped through the familiar pages, looking for comfort in verses Margaret used to read aloud, something metallic slipped out from between the pages of Proverbs. A small, rusted key wrapped in tissue paper. Evelyn unwrapped it carefully, and as she did, a folded piece of paper fell into her lap. She recognized Margaret's handwriting immediately. My Evelyn, the note read, what is hidden in light shall remain unseen by greed. Follow the key, and you will find what love built in secret. The cottage on Maple Street holds what they cannot take. Look for the blue shutters. Everything I promised you is waiting. Evelyn's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the paper. Maple Street was across town, in an older neighborhood she rarely visited. What cottage? What blue shutters? What had Margaret built in secret? For the first time since the will reading, Evelyn felt something other than devastation. She felt hope. The next morning, Evelyn woke up to the sound of strangers' voices in the hallway outside her room. She checked the clock, 7:30 in the morning. She'd barely slept, clutching Margaret's note and the mysterious key, trying to make sense of what Margaret could have meant. When she opened her door, she found two men in work clothes measuring the hallway. Excuse me, she said to one of them. What are you doing? Renovation consultation. The man replied without looking up from his measuring tape. This whole upstairs is getting gutted and redesigned. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She found Richard in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper like it was any other day. You're having the house renovated already? She asked. Richard looked up with mock surprise. Oh, you're still here. Yes, Caroline has some wonderful ideas for modernizing this place. She's moving back home to help me manage the transition. Caroline walked into the kitchen at that moment, carrying fabric samples and paint swatches. She barely acknowledged Evelyn's presence. Dad, I think we should do the guest room in that sage green color. It'll be perfect for my home office, Caroline said. The guest room? Evelyn repeated. That's my room. Caroline finally looked at her. Was your room? Past tense. I thought Dad explained that you'd be moving out this week. It's Tuesday, Evelyn said. You said I had a week. Actually, Richard said, folding his newspaper. I've been thinking about that timeline. Caroline needs to get settled, and having construction crews working around your belongings seems impractical. I think it would be better if you finished packing today. Evelyn felt the walls closing in. Today? I haven't even found a place to live yet. That's unfortunate, Richard said, but not really our problem anymore. David appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee and grinning. Morning, everyone. The moving truck is here. Moving truck? Evelyn asked. For Caroline's stuff, David explained. She's got a lot of furniture and things from her apartment. Dad figured it would be easier to move her in if your room was empty first. Evelyn looked around the kitchen at these people she'd once considered family. They had choreographed this perfectly. They weren't just kicking her out. They were erasing her presence as quickly as possible. I need at least until tonight to pack, Evelyn said. The movers need access to that room by noon, Caroline said without a hint of sympathy. I'm sure you understand. Evelyn spent the next 4 hours throwing her entire life into garbage bags and suitcases. 22 years of belongings, photographs, books, clothes, all of it crammed into whatever containers she could find. The movers came and went, carrying Caroline's expensive furniture into the room where Evelyn had slept since she was 11 years old. As she loaded her car with the last of her things, Richard appeared in the driveway. Before you go, he said, I need Margaret's Bible back. Evelyn's heart stopped. What? Margaret's Bible. It's a family heirloom. It should stay with the family. I am family, Evelyn said desperately. No, Richard said firmly. You're not. The Bible belongs to Margaret's blood relatives now. Evelyn's mind raced. The key was inside that Bible. Margaret's note was inside that Bible. Whatever secret Margaret had left for her was connected to that Bible. Please, she said. It's all I have left of her. You have your memories, Richard said coldly. That should be sufficient. Evelyn thought quickly. The Bible was in her purse, which was in her car. Richard couldn't see it from where he was standing. I think I might have accidentally packed it in one of these bags, she lied. Can I bring it by tomorrow when I find it? Richard's eyes narrowed. I want it back by the end of the week, Evelyn. Don't make me ask again. That night, Evelyn sat in a cheap motel room that smelled like industrial cleaner and despair. She'd spent the afternoon driving around town looking for the cottage on Maple Street that Margaret had mentioned in her note. But Maple Street was longer than she'd realized, and there were dozens of small houses, many of them abandoned or run down. She'd seen 3 houses with blue shutters, but none of them looked like places Margaret would have secretly owned. One was clearly occupied by a family with children's toys in the yard. Another was so dilapidated it looked condemned. The third was behind a chain-link fence with no trespassing signs. As she sat on the motel bed, surrounded by garbage bags full of her belongings, Evelyn began to question everything. What if Margaret's note was just the confused writing of a sick woman? What if there was no cottage, no secret inheritance, no hidden treasure waiting for her? What if she was clinging to false hope because the alternative, accepting that she truly was alone in the world, was too painful to bear? Her phone rang. It was her boss from the law firm. Evelyn, I got your message about extending your leave, he said. I'm sorry, but we can't hold your position indefinitely. We need you back by Monday, or we'll have to consider it a resignation. I understand, Evelyn said, though she didn't understand anything anymore. Are you all right? You sound terrible. Evelyn almost laughed. Terrible didn't begin to cover it. Fine. I'll call you by Friday to let you know about Monday. After she hung up, Evelyn realized she had exactly 3 days to either find whatever Margaret had left for her or accept that she needed to rebuild her entire life from scratch. 3 days to solve a mystery that might not even exist, while living in a motel room that cost $60 a night, money she didn't have for very long. The next morning, she drove back to Maple Street with renewed determination. This time, she parked and walked the entire length of the street, looking more carefully at each property. She was looking for blue shutters specifically, but she was also looking for any sign that Margaret might have been here. Halfway down the street, she found it. A small cottage with faded blue shutters, almost hidden behind overgrown hedges and an untended garden. The house looked abandoned, but there was something about it that felt familiar. The style of the front porch reminded her of the dollhouse Margaret had given her when she was 12. Evelyn walked up to the front door, her heart pounding. The key from Margaret's Bible was in her hand, but she hesitated. What if this was the wrong house? What if someone lived here and called the police? What if the key didn't fit? But as she got closer to the front door, she noticed something that made